Greetings to all of you. I'm Michael Boriskin, and I'm standing inside the National Historic Landmark home of our namesake, the iconic composer Aaron Copland. And I am really glad to welcome you to Cultivated Spaces 2.0. This is the virtual version of our Cultivate Emerging Composers Institute, which is an annual week-long all-scholarship creative workshop and mentoring program for gifted composers at the initial stages of their professional careers. This special place is also the perfect backdrop to step into Copland's world and talk for a minute about Cultivate. As Copland recedes into history, it's increasingly easy to forget what an extraordinary musical citizen he was, an exceptionally generous and effective champion of his fellow composers. And everything we do here at Copland House is animated by Copland's peerless advocacy for American music in general. And that is especially the case with Cultivate, which is all about supporting the artistic development of gifted young composers and aiding in their career advancement as well. Today, we're featuring one of our Cultivate Fellows from 2021, Juhi Bansal, and the work she wrote for Cultivate called 13 Moons, which, she says, was inspired by the arid landscape and howling winds of the California desert. First, Juhi will say a few words of introduction. Then we will turn to music from Copland House's premiere performance of 13 Moons. And finally, Juhi will return for a brief conversation with Cultivate's director, Derek Bermel. So thanks again for joining us, and please enjoy the performance.
Hi, everybody. I wanted to just tell you a little bit about my piece 13 Moons that you're about to hear. Now, the piece is inspired by one of my favorite places in the desert Southwest. And if you can imagine it, or if you've spent any time there, it's one of those places that is just wide, wide open space. If you turn around, it's so easy to get lost because everything looks just sort of like everything else around you. Very arid, very dry. You're surrounded by scrub brush, small rocks, large boulders, and every once in a while there'll be like a piece of rolling tumbleweed or maybe some dust devils that'll get kicked up. So the piece is kind of a musical snapshot of this place. So you're going to hear a lot of very percussive effects, some very dry sounds, a lot of silence, and every once in a while something that's kind of shimmering or moving and kind of trying to create this feeling of wind. I hope you enjoyed the piece. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. My name is Derek Bermel, and I'm the director of the Cultivate Composers Institute at the Copland House. It's my pleasure to introduce Juhi Bansal, whose piece we've just heard, 13 Moons. And maybe we can talk a little bit about the piece, Juhi.
That sounds fantastic. Thanks, Derek, and hi.
Great to see you. And I felt rock and roll when I was listening to this piece, and but I want to know your inspirations behind this piece, and then how you took those inspirations and made them into music.
It's interesting that you mentioned rock and roll, because I wasn't thinking of that in this piece specifically, but I always feel like, when you listen to Jimi Hendrix and you start getting all those crazy timbres and like color changes and things, that's very much something that's in the back of my mind, and in other pieces I've kind of leaned into very purposefully. Here, I think it kind of just snuck into this sound world. The larger inspiration for me actually was this, it's like desert area in the Southwest, where there's a spot, it's supposed to be kind of a secret spot called 13 Moons. And, it's one of these landscapes that is just so barren and so arid. It's all like dry dust all over the place. Lots of flowing wind. Every once in a while, it's like tumbleweed and rolling things. And, that's kind of the essence of what I was trying to capture. And, I don't know if the rock influence in this piece was so purposeful, but that is something that's always at the back of my mind, I'll be honest. And particularly when I'm trying to write something rhythmic, it tends to creep up a lot. So this was more about color, but I think naturally there's a little bit of the kind of, if anything, Jimi Hendrix probably was in the back of my mind.
Yeah, blowing in the tumbleweed there. And I think the desert, it is such a stark reality and such a stark kind of, it has such a very particular, both beautiful and devastating quality at the same time. So how did you approach that musically? I mean, when I heard, as I was listening to this, were these motives that keep repeating and cycling around, and then kind of evolve into this melody that bursts out toward the end. But how did you approach writing that? How did you transform a physical landscape, into sound?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I think probably the starting point for me was just silence. When you're in these places in the desert, it is so quiet, and any sound you hear kind of, it almost feels like your attention goes from here to there to here and kind of back and forth very quickly, because every single sound you hear feels loud and really stands out. So for me, kind of, trying to do exactly what you said, trying to take the landscape and put it in sound, silence was the biggest part of it. Wanting to make sure that there's lots of space, and then things happen, gestures happen in a way that's not totally predictable. And kind of this idea, you mentioned that these gestures that keep coming back and motives that keep coming back. It's weird because the desert, it's like there's so much happening, but it feels initially like a lot of the same things. Rocks, when you look at them the first time, they all kind of look the same. They're not, but they all do kind of look the same. And the trees and the bushes all kind of look the same. So there was this kind of sense of like wanting it to feel like nothing's changing too much and not changing too much and not changing too much, until it does build into something that feels a little bit more climactic, where that melody comes in.
And tell us about how your own musical background, how does that come into the way you write this music? Because, when I look at the score, in some ways, when you listen to this piece, it all just sounds very natural. The melodies, the rhythms that kind of interrupt, but then the score is quite complex, and you've used a lot of glissando in this piece. So you allowed the instruments to kind of wave around and flow in and out. And you mentioned Jimi Hendrix. I heard that in the wailing violin at the end. That almost sounds like electric guitar. But how did you talk a little bit about your musical background and then the notation that you wrote?
Sure. My background is all over the place, to be honest. I think that's more and more true of all composers these days. But like, I lived in India as a kid, and then my family moved to Hong Kong, and then I moved to the States. So my musical background for a long time was listening to Hindustani classical music. So, you're talking about some of those glissandi in particular, and these lines that just feel like they're moving without stop. That is sort of a sound I feel like I have in my ear, in part because that's so much what happens in Hindustani music. Not in this form, but that kind of idea. And, in high school, I remember I'd be doing classical piano and classical voice and violin, and then playing erhu and the Chinese ensemble, because this was all in Hong Kong, and like listening to rock and listening to canto pop and musical theater and all these things. So it seems very natural to me, and I think it's a very big a part of my style, just to bring together all these things that maybe don't seem like they fit, but they are just organic influences to what I have in my ear.
Wow! So you have the influence of this kind of the modal influence of the Hindustani music. You have the influence of an instrument, a particular instrument, the erhu, which is Chinese, and I guess, and then of course you have this conservatory trained side as well. So these three things that are pulling at you from different directions, and somehow you're merging these and melding them into one language. And so how did that work in terms of making the score and writing for these particular musicians who are playing violin, cello, which have something to do with the erhu, but maybe not exactly same kind of thing?
I don't think it was very deliberate in this piece, kind of really purposefully trying to draw from one or the other thing. They're kind of just like almost like banks of information, or ideas that you have in the back of your mind. I think this is how everybody these days, I mean, all the classical composers I know all listen to rock music and metal and all these things. So like, I don't think any of us are quite as straight-laced in a single direction as sometimes people assume. So there was, I would say more organically for me, it was this idea of always trying to draw on this landscape. And it helps for me to have that as a central concept. Then I can pull these colors and these textures. And I thought like the glissandi gestures and the strings could be pretty evocative with like soltasto, for example, of like some of the wind kind of sounds where you don't get that beautiful traditional string tone, but you get kind of a more fragmented, slightly distorted tone as well. And everything is fully notated because I knew I was writing for a piano trio. It's the players certainly are fabulous, and it doesn't have to be traditional, but that is the tradition in which they're used to reading notation. And there is a little bit that is, I don't want to say not really aleatoric in this piece, although I do that a lot. But things where the performer has some say over exactly how things happen or exactly how colors change or when things move. So there's a little bit of that in this piece as well, but most of it is really written out and planned.
And how did COVID times play into that? I mean, we're still kind of in COVID times, of course, but I think at the time when this happened, it was a very particular time. There were some things were starting to come back into focus, but then there was a new variant coming out, I guess the Delta variant. I'm trying to think back to this moment, and everything still felt very unsure. There were vaccines, but now we were going back into lockdowns. And did that play into this at all? And what was the week like for you? The Cultivate week?
I suppose if I start with the first part of that, it's interesting with the pandemic. I feel like it's gone on long enough that there's been phases creatively. This was still in the phase where it was early enough. I felt like it made sense to it felt like things were going to end soon. So there was this sense for me of it in writing this piece, it was about looking forward and looking kind of beyond to what would happen after the pandemic. And, in retrospect, we can say it's been going on and who knows what'll happen next. But at the time, there was this sense for me of just like, we were in lockdown. I do remember that, like having just come out of a long period of just being stuck in the same space and even being limited in how much we were allowed to go outside. So there was something where really just wanting to focus on outdoor spaces and wild spaces, and kind of think not about what's happening on the computer and in the world, but really something that I was excited about outside of that. That was really, I think, artistically what was in the back of my mind with this piece.
And I guess I had asked you two questions, but the other was, what was the week like? I mean, in terms of working with the musicians and getting to throw ideas out and have ideas come back at you.
That was so exciting, actually. And, it's when we're normally, like when you're able to be physically in the space for a festival, I feel like there is so much energy that kind of goes back and forth with those interactions. And the thing that was actually really exciting about this is, although it was translated into kind of a Zoom format, where we'd meet and we'd rehearse online, and then you'd close the laptop and all of a sudden it felt like you're back in your own space. But there was enough of that energy because we'd have rehearsals and I'd get suggestions from the musicians and suggestions from you, and we'd talk about this thing's kind of working, this is maybe not working as well as I had wanted it to. So there was still, it was wonderful, some element of feeling like when you're in the space with the musicians that kind of continued through the week, even after Zoom was logged out and the screen was closed.
Well, it's great to see you again after all this time, and congratulations on this piece, 13 Moons. I hope it has a lot more performances in the future. And can you tell us really quickly what you're doing next?
Oh gosh, a bunch of projects. Most immediately right now, I am just finishing up a piece for Songfest. They commissioned a song cycle, and I chose a number of texts by Afghani women and Afghani girls. Kind of thinking about the aftermath of the states pulling out of, and kind of what that left in Afghanistan. So the song cycle is all on poetry by Afghani women, and it's going to be premiered in June of 2022 at San Francisco Conservatory.
Wow. Well, I guess I can say break a leg, but in any case, it's great to see you, and great to hear your music again, and good luck with everything.
Thank you so much, Derek. So nice to see you again, too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.